Thus far in the class, we've been talking about how the Industrial Revolution was really changing things from the perspective of freedom in American life. And in a lot of ways, I think what you can say is that the Industrial Revolution really ushered in a period of an expansion of freedom in a number of different ways. For instance, you've got the case of Sam Patch. You're reading Sam Patch and you understand that in ways his freedom and his opportunity have been limited or at least jeopardized by this process of industrialization, but at the same time there's an awakening there. There's an eye-opening experience in which workers are becoming conscious of this process of limited freedom or limitations on their freedom. And so therefore, in a lot of ways, you've got workers that are demanding their rights. So in what I want you to take away from this is, as we get further and further into the 19th century, you begin to see an expansion of freedom. You begin to see an expansion of democracy. You begin to see an expansion of opportunity. But you should understand that this expansion pretty much exists for white men. It's a process known as a white man's government. That's what historians refer to it as. In other words, the United States is becoming increasingly democratic with a small d for white males and less democratic for everybody else. Now, we'll see this in a variety of different forms and fashions, but I want to begin with women, American women. Various things that you can point to with respect to what's happening to the freedom of women. We've talked about the women workers of Lowell, Massachusetts. We know that in ways their freedom was expanding, and in ways it was contracting. But by the early 19th century, women were expected to serve as auxiliaries, right? Their roles were helpers, bread givers, not necessarily breadwinners. There was a bit of a pushback. For example, you've got people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. We've talked a little bit about people like Abigail Adams that had told her pragmatic-minded husband, don't forget about the ladies. But for the most part, women were expected to take a second-class role when it comes to citizenship in the United States. When they would press for more rights, more of a voice, the critics of enfranchising, giving women the vote, would point to an institution that they called Republican motherhood. Now, what they meant was within the dynamic of the American family, women exercised a lot of control. Again, this is not my thought. It's more or less the thought of the time, for the critics anyway. Now, what they meant was, because they exercised so much control inside the dynamic of the family, they were able to influence their male counterparts, their husbands, their sons, their brothers, their uncles, all their male relatives, to get them to vote for whatever candidate that they wanted them to vote, or vote on whatever issue that they wanted them to vote. And so therefore, what the men are saying is, even though you don't have a vote in the traditional sense, you do have a lot of influence within the family, within the family itself, and therefore there's no need to enfranchise you. In a lot of ways, this is a very aristocratic version of republicanism, a form of government that's not inherited, a form of government by the people. But at the same time, we're also seeing people beginning to ask fundamental questions, including women. Why is it that we don't have a role to play in the democratic process? The next group that I'd like to talk to you about would be Native Americans. Now we know, and I really pressed that point upon you with the War of 1812, we know that since the end of that war, the American government is more or less going to dictate terms to the Native American communities throughout the United States. And I think what you can say about that is you're going to generally see an erosion of land rights, land accessibility for Native Americans. Keep in mind, everybody, Native Americans are not citizens, and they don't have any voice in the democratic process. As a matter of fact, it's not going to be well until the 20th century that we're really going to consider enfranchising, giving natives citizenship rights to begin with. So my point with Native Americans is there's very little ways that they have, there are very few ways that they have of resisting this whole process of having their land taken out from underneath them. One quick example. In 1830, Congress passed something called the Indian Removal Act, and it did exactly what it sounds like it does. It told Native Americans in specific parts of the United States, you are going to have to cede, give up your ancestral homelands, and you will be moved to a reservation. One of these groups was the Cherokee Nation in the southeastern part of what is now the United States, and they resisted, and they were pretty good at resisting. And ultimately, a few years after this law is passed, it's Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, that mobilizes the American military and forcibly removes the Cherokee from northwestern Georgia, from the western chunk of the Carolinas. And this is a process that I bet many of you have heard of before. It's called the Trail of Tears. There's very little that the Cherokee or any other group of Native Americans can do to resist this process. And furthermore, what I also want you to understand about the Trail of Tears episode is that this is seen as progressive by the standards of people like Andrew Jackson. Because when you remove the Native Americans from that part of the country, you open up their former land to white expansion, white settlement. And so it's a classic example of the United States becoming more democratic for white men and less democratic for everybody else, Native Americans included. But the real glaring contradiction to the idea of democracy and freedom and whatever you'd like to use for the description of the United States at the time was slavery. Okay, emancipation, the freeing of slaves, this didn't happen all at once. It was very progressive. It was very episodic, and there were times throughout American history that we saw this accelerate. For example, one of the ways that you could attain your freedom if you happen to be African American is by fighting in the American Revolution. I don't know if you remember me talking about it, but one of the things that Britain was trying to do to really squash the rebellion early on was offering African Americans their freedom if they defected, left their plantations, and came and fought with the British. Well, to match that offer, the Americans had to give them the same sort of deal. And so fighting in the American Revolution was one way to emancipate oneself, and several African Americans were able to do that. We know that some people actually were able to buy their freedom, and by the dawn of the 19th century, we do have a relatively broad, free African American community. Places like Virginia, places like Kentucky, it's growing. You also see a growing movement that we'll call evangelical abolitionism. Evangelical Christian abolitionism, the abolishment of slavery. These are individuals that believe that slavery is a sin in the Christian faith and therefore needs to be stricken from American society for that reason. This group is going to become more and more forceful in American life, both literally and figuratively speaking, when it comes to the issue of abolition. Slavery is dying in the North. Okay, we know it's beginning to fade in the North, and I want you to understand, it's not as if people in New York or New Jersey are just better people than Virginia or Alabama. It's got everything to do with the ecology, the climate in Massachusetts really just does not lend itself well to the type of industries that would really complement slavery well. It's not an agrarian economy in New York. I mean, for the most part it's not, and it's certainly not in Massachusetts. It's very diversified, it's very commercial, and so therefore you've only got about 3 or 4 months, if you're lucky, of the growing season, and you're talking about buying somebody for life, and that's a huge investment. And so from the perspective of Massachusetts, from the perspective of New York and New Jersey, it just does not make a lot of financial sense to implement chattel slavery. So slavery is dying in the North for that reason. But in the South, what you see happen is it not only continues, we'll talk about this with the Cotton Revolution, but it actually expands. It grows, it gets bigger, and it also gets much, much more important. You will find that there is no bigger issue in American political life in the 19th century than the institution of slavery, where it can go and what it can do. And one individual of the Southern variety that really asked these fundamental questions was a guy from Kentucky. We've talked about him and we'll continue to talk about him, a guy by the name of Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay was an opponent of slavery, which is a little bit odd considering he was at one point in time a slave owner in his own right. Henry Clay started an organization called the American Colonization Society, which was anti-slavery inherently, and it wanted to abolish the institution of slavery. Now, don't give him too much credit quite yet, because one of the things that Clay wanted to do after the slaves had been emancipated was send them to Africa. Did you notice how I didn't say back to Africa? The reason I didn't say back to Africa is because you're not talking about Africans. I mean, it's been over 100 years since we have been talking about an African slave workforce. We're talking about people that had been born, raised, bred on the American continent, and so therefore it would essentially be a deportation campaign. Okay. Now, one of the biggest critics of the American Colonization Society was a former slave by the name of Richard Allen. Now, Richard Allen was one of these individuals that was able to attain his freedom in his adult life, and he also became a very instrumental figure not only within the abolition movement, but also within the African American Church. He was a minister and a very important figure within the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and as you're going to see in a few seconds here, this second Great Awakening, as it will come to be called, is going to play a major role in the abolition movement, the movement to abolish the institution of slavery. I'll talk about why here momentarily. But if you recall, when we were talking about the first Great Awakening, George Whitefield and people of that sort, you're talking about a series of religious revivals taking place across the North, but also in the South. Around about the same time, you're seeing a second Great Awakening, okay? A second spiritual time in American history, more of these religious revivals, more people really beginning to reinterpret biblical passages and their meaning in modern-day American life. Now, for the African American community, what that means in a lot of ways is separatist churches. Okay, a separate church for the Baptists, black and white, a separate church for the Methodists. I've already told you about the African Episcopal, Methodist Episcopal Church. What I need you to understand about the black churches is, first of all, Protestantism, Christian Protestantism, was adapted to fit the needs of the abolition movement. Why? Well, the black church was, first of all, the only place in American life where black men could, and to a lesser extent women, could enjoy some semblance of leadership roles and impose any semblance of order on their day-to-day life. So it's important in that respect alone. But it's inside these black churches that you're beginning to see the discussions emerge and evolve, and this is especially the case in the North, regarding the abolition movement. How do we bring the abolition movement into mainstream politics? So it's very important that you understand that the Second Great Awakening is important for a lot of different reasons, religiosity reasons, but it's also very important because it's the bedrock of the abolition movement for both the white community and the black community. Now think about it. Where are we going to see the epicenter of the civil rights movement about 100 years later in the 20th century? Many of that is going to emerge from the black churches. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, for example, is instrumental in the organizational efforts for people like Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy. So anyway, the last thing that I'd like you to understand about this issue of slavery in American politics would be the crisis that's emanating from Missouri. Now, for those of you that have been following on closely, you know that Missouri was essentially part of what was called the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson in 1804 purchased that chunk of territory that was north and west of the present-day city of New Orleans, and it became known as the Louisiana Territory. people had been emigrating to parts of the Louisiana Territory for years, up until 1820. And in 1820, Missouri finally had enough people to where it could petition for statehood. Missouri wants to enter the United States as an official state, and wants to do so as a slave state. Okay? Now, we know that slavery is becoming a very hot button issue, and we've already made compromises to keep the peace, so to speak, between the free states and the slave states. One individual that does not want to see Missouri become a slave state because he knows it's going to tip the balance of power in favor of the slave states is a New York senator, a guy by the name of James Talmadge. Okay, Talmadge said it's fine that Missouri comes into the country, but the only way that Missouri can come in is if it officially becomes a free state. We're not going to accept it otherwise. Now keep in mind, more people live in the North, and that means that a congressman, a member of the House of Representatives, like Talmadge, a New Yorker, is probably going to not have much of a problem passing this through the House of Representatives, considering the North has an advantage there. The free states have an advantage there. Where it's going to run into trouble and where it ultimately dies, this initiative anyway, is the Senate. Not only do you have an even number of southern and northern senators there, you also have a very, very powerful pro-slavery voting bloc in the Senate. And what the Senate basically does is say, if you want to play hardball, we can play hardball, right? If you want to block Missouri, we're going to block Maine. In the same year, 1820, Maine had petitioned for statehood. It was breaking away from what was Massachusetts, and it wanted to become a free state. And so what the Senate is saying is, if you block Missouri, we will block Maine, and so you've got a crisis on your hand. Neither side appears all that willing to budge. And ultimately, what we do is we make a compromise that comes to be known as the Compromise of 1820, or more succinctly, the Missouri Compromise. And what we do is we say, look, you've got an even number. Henry Clay is sort of the architect of this Missouri Compromise. There's an even number. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. You've got one state that wants to be free, one state that's going to be a slave state, and so therefore there will be two senators from each state. They'll balance each other out. You'll keep the balance of power in Congress. And everybody's like, all right, fine, we see what your point is there, Henry Clay, but how do we prevent this from happening ever again? We don't want to keep going through this as we add more territory from the Louisiana Purchase. Henry Clay said, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take the 36th 30th parallel, which happened to be the southern border of Missouri, and we're going to make that the dividing point. Anything south of there will automatically become a slave state. So Arkansas, Louisiana, those are going to be slave states. Anything to the north of there, Iowa, for instance, it will be a free state. And everybody seems to be able to, accept that. And for the better part of really 40 years, maybe even longer than that, the Missouri Compromise had managed to keep the peace between the free states and the slave states. Or put another way, the Missouri Compromise was able to prevent civil war. The Missouri Compromise is going to break down and fail when we begin to add yet more territory in the late 1840s and especially in the 1850s. When we go to add states like California, Kansas, and Nebraska, that's when this whole issue of what can slavery do and where can it go, that's when it's going to reemerge. But for the time being, I want to end this discussion by talking to you about how the North and the South are growing increasingly apart from one another. In the South, what you've got is what we call aristocratic republicanism, okay? The leaders of the South, the governmental leaders, those are people that are your rich landowning, predominantly cotton, tobacco growing elites. You do have democracy in the South for white men, but for the most part, the people that are making the big decisions and the people that are making the important decisions as it relates to the economy, those are the wealthy elite. In the North, what you've got is a free labor society. I want you to write that down, free labor society. In the North, there's this perception that there's more freedom, primarily because people say we're prospering because our democratic institutions. If a worker feels mistreated in New York, for instance, he can go down the road, get a job with another employer that's going to pay him better, going to treat him better, going to treat him with more dignity. Obviously, you can't do that in the South if you're a slave, but I would make the case that you can't do that even if you happen to be a working-class white man. if you grew cotton and you didn't own slaves in a place like Alabama, what that meant was that you had to compete with all of these really large, very rich, and slave-owning elites, and that really limited your ability to not only make it in the world, but also impose any kind of democratic order on your day-to-day life. Now, as we found out with the Industrial Revolution, there's contradictions of democracy in both systems. Clearly, the free labor society is not exactly as free as the North would like to think it is. We saw that in the case of the workers at Lowell, Massachusetts, that were prevented from even doing something as simple as going to dance class after they got off of work. There are obvious contradictions with the chattel slavery system for both black and working class whites. But we're going to continue to see the North and the South grow increasingly apart as our class unfolds. But for right now, that's where we're going to leave it.